There is a place in the middle of the Sahara Desert that, for almost the entire history of our species, no human being ever truly saw. Not because it was hidden underground, not because it was buried under sand, but because it is too big, so vast, so impossibly wide, that if you were standing right in the center of it, you would have no idea you were standing inside anything at all. You'd just see desert, rock and sand stretching to the horizon in every direction. It was only when human beings finally left the planet and looked back down from space that we saw it for what it really is. A giant eye, staring up out of the desert. Perfect rings, one inside the other, like ripples frozen in stone, nearly 50 kilometers across. From orbit, it looks like a target, a bullseye carved into one of the most lifeless places on Earth. Astronauts use it as a landmark, because out there in that endless ocean of sand, it's one of the only features big enough and strange enough to recognize from hundreds of kilometers up. They call it the Eye of the Sahara. Geologists call it the Richat Structure. And for decades, people have looked at those impossibly perfect circles and asked the same question. What could possibly make rings like that? And there is one answer, one explanation, that has spread across the internet and lodged itself in millions of minds. An answer so bold, so seductive, that once you hear it, it is very hard to let go of. The claim is this, that the Eye of the Sahara is not a natural formation at all, that those rings are the remains of the most famous lost city in human history, that hidden in plain sight, in the middle of the desert, scorched and abandoned, and staring up at the sky, are the ruins of Atlantis. And here's the thing. When you actually line up the evidence, the case is far, far stronger than you would expect. It is not a stupid theory. It is not something only a fool would believe. The pieces fit together in a way that will genuinely unsettle you. By the time I've laid it all out, a part of you is going to be convinced. I'm warning you now. But then we're going to do something the conspiracy videos never do. We're going to keep going. We're going to bring in what the rock itself has to say. And the truth, the real truth of what made this eye in the desert, turns out to be even stranger, even older, and in its own way even more incredible than a lost city ever could be. So before we descend into this mystery, do me a favor and subscribe, because we are going to walk right up to the edge of believing in Atlantis together, and then I'm going to show you what's really down there. Let's start with the eye itself. The Richat Structure sits in a country called Mauritania, in the West African nation's vast, empty Sahara region. It is roughly circular, made up of a series of concentric ridges and valleys, rings nested inside rings, with the whole thing spanning somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 kilometers in diameter. That's an area so large you could fit a major city inside it with room to spare. For the people who lived in that region, the eye was just part of the landscape. Up close on the ground, the rings are simply long, low cliffs and ridges of rock, curving gently away. Walk along one and it might feel like nothing more than a line of hills. You would never, ever guess that you were tracing the edge of a perfect circle dozens of kilometers wide. The shape only reveals itself from high above, which is exactly why it remained one of the planet's best-kept visual secrets until the era of flight and then spaceflight. When astronauts in early space missions looked down and spotted it, this great staring eye in the sand, it immediately became one of the most photographed natural landmarks on Earth from orbit. But it was the shape that started the whispers. Because human beings are pattern-finding animals. We see a face in the clouds, a figure in the shadows. And when we see perfect nested concentric rings, something deep in our brain says, that's not random. That's designed. Something made that. And there is one ancient story, told 2,500 years ago, that describes a place with exactly that shape. A great city, built in rings, rings of land and water, nested one inside the other. A story so famous that its name has become a byword for every lost world we've ever dreamed of. To understand why so many people look at the Eye of the Sahara and see a drowned civilization, we have to go back to where the legend of Atlantis was actually born. And we have to lay out, honestly and completely, just how eerily well the two stories seem to match. The story of Atlantis comes to us from a single source. One man, writing in ancient Greece, around 2,400 years ago, the philosopher Plato. He described a powerful island civilization, a great naval empire that existed long before his own time. And then he wrote, in a single terrible day and night, catastrophe struck, and the entire civilization sank beneath the waves and vanished forever. For thousands of years, people have argued about whether Atlantis was real or just a story. But set that argument aside for a moment, because what matters right now is the description, the details Plato gave. Because when you hold those details up against the eye of the Sahara, something genuinely strange happens. They start to line up. Let's go through them one by one, and I want you to feel the weight of this building, because this is the part that gets people. First, the shape. Plato described the central city of Atlantis as being built in a very specific pattern. Concentric rings, alternating rings of land and water, one inside the other, surrounding a central island. Rings within rings. Now look again at the eye of the Sahara. Concentric rings, one inside the other, around a center. The single most distinctive feature of Atlantis, the thing everyone remembers about it, is the exact feature that makes the Richat structure famous. That alone is enough to make you sit up. But it doesn't stop there. Plato gave a size for the central plain of Atlantis. And when people convert his ancient measurements into modern ones, the numbers they come up with for the width of that central region land suspiciously close to the actual diameter of the eye. The scale seems to match. A structure dozens of kilometers across, just like the dimensions described in the ancient text. Then there's the location. Plato wrote that Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The Pillars of Heracles is the ancient name for what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow gateway between the Mediterranean Sea and the open Atlantic Ocean. Beyond it, meaning out past that strait, into the wider world to the west and south. And where is the eye of the Sahara? In northwest Africa, which is in fact beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, out in exactly the broad region Plato pointed to. The geography is not wrong. It fits. And there's more. Plato described mountains to the north of the city of Atlantis, sheltering it. And to the north of the Richat structure, there is indeed higher, mountainous terrain. He described a vast flat plain. The land around and within the eye is, broadly, a flat desert plain. He described the city as being near the sea, with access to the ocean. And while the eye today sits inland, supporters point out that the coastline of West Africa is not impossibly far, and that sea levels and landscapes change dramatically over thousands of years. Stack all of that together, the rings, the size, the location beyond Gibraltar, the mountains to the north, the plain. Each piece on its own might be a coincidence, but all of them, pointing at the same spot in the desert? That's what makes this theory so powerful. That's why it has convinced so many people. It doesn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It feels like a match. And I'll be honest with you, if we stopped right here, if this was where the video ended, you would walk away at least half believing that the ruins of Atlantis are sitting in the Sahara. The case is that compelling on its surface. If you're feeling that pull right now, that little voice saying, wait, maybe there's something to this, drop a comment and tell me how convinced you are at this exact moment on a scale of 1 to 10. I'm genuinely curious. And then keep watching. Because we're about to turn the page and we're going to look at what Plato actually wrote in full and at what the ground itself is made of. And both of those things are going to start pulling this beautiful theory apart. Because here is the first crack. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Everything I just told you came from carefully selecting the details that match. That's how a compelling case is built. You line up the hits and you stay quiet about the misses. So let's stop selecting. Let's go back to the original text, the actual words Plato wrote, and read all of it, not just the convenient parts. And the moment you do that, the moment you read the full description of Atlantis instead of the highlight reel, you run straight into details that don't just fail to match the eye of the Sahara. They flatly contradict it. The first thing the full text tells you is when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. Plato didn't leave this vague. He gave a number. He wrote that the story took place around 9,000 years before his own time. Plato lived roughly 2,500 years ago, so did the arithmetic, and Atlantis was supposedly a thriving, advanced civilization around 11,500 years ago. Hold that number in your mind, because it is the first thing that breaks. 11,500 years ago, Human beings were not building vast naval empires with stone cities ringed by canals. That was the tail end of the last ice age. People were hunter-gatherers. Agriculture itself had barely begun to flicker into existence in a few corners of the world. There were no great seafaring superpowers, no monumental ringed capitals anywhere on the planet. The timeline Plato gives belongs to a world of stone tools and mammoths, not marble harbors and fleets. But that's a problem about civilization in general. Let's get more specific because the Eye of the Sahara has its own, much deeper problem with Plato's account. And it comes down to one word: sank. This is the absolute heart of the Atlantis story. The entire reason Atlantis is legendary, the thing that makes it Atlantis and not just some old abandoned town, is that it sank. Plato is explicit and dramatic about it. The island was struck by violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night, it disappeared into the depths of the sea. It went under. The ocean swallowed it whole. That is the climax, the tragedy, the entire point of the legend. Atlantis is a place that is now underwater. Now look at the Eye of the Sahara. It is sitting in the middle of a desert. It is not underwater. It has not sunk beneath any ocean. It is, in fact, sitting at a perfectly normal elevation on dry land, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest sea, baking under the African sun. The one defining event of the entire Atlantis myth, the sinking, the thing without which there is no story, simply never happened here. The Eye didn't sink. It rose. We'll get to exactly how in a moment, but understand the contradiction. To believe the Eye is Atlantis, you have to ignore the single most important fact Plato gave us about it. And the believers have an answer for this, of course. They always do. They'll say, well, maybe the sea levels dropped, or maybe Plato got that part wrong, or maybe the sinking was symbolic. And notice what's happening there. Notice the move. Every time the evidence contradicts the theory gets bent to absorb it. The match was supposed to be the proof. But when parts of it don't match, suddenly those parts don't count. That's not how you find the truth. That's how you protect a belief you've already decided to keep. There's another detail people quietly skip past. Plato described Atlantis as an island surrounded by sea that a person could sail to and around. The Eye of the Sahara is not an island, and never was an island in human history. It's a feature carved into a massive, continuous landmass, the bedrock of an entire continent. There's no shoreline around it. There never was a shoreline around it in the time of humans. It is solid African crust, the same rock that stretches for thousands of kilometers in every direction. So we have a place that's the wrong age by thousands of years, that never sank when sinking is the whole point, and that was never an island when being an island is fundamental to the description. The beautiful match is starting to look a lot less beautiful. The hits we lined up earlier, the rings, the size, the rough location, they're real enough on the surface. But they were doing a magic trick on you. They were drawing your eye to the coincidences while the contradictions sat in the shadows. But maybe you're still not fully convinced. Maybe a stubborn part of you is thinking, all right, the timeline and the sinking are problems, but those rings are so perfect, so deliberate. Surely nature couldn't carve something that geometric by accident. Surely the rings themselves are evidence that someone built this. That instinct is completely understandable, and it is exactly where the real investigation begins. Because to truly settle this, we can't just argue about an old Greek text. We have to do something far more powerful. We have to go down to the Eye itself, pick up the rock in our hands, and ask it directly, were you ever a city? And the rock gives an answer that is absolutely unambiguous. Let's listen to what the stones have to say. When geologists go to the Eye of the Sahara and study what it's actually made of, they are not looking at the remains of anything built. There are no walls, there are no foundations, there are no cut stones, no bricks, no harbors, no roads, no canals, no pottery, no metalwork, nothing. None of the things you find at every genuine ancient city site on Earth. And believe me, archaeologists know what a buried city looks like. We have found them all over the world, swallowed by jungle and sand and time, and they always leave traces. Worked stone, tools, the signatures of human hands. The Eye of the Sahara has none of that. What it has instead is rock. natural rock. And that rock tells a story far older than humanity. Let's start with what those rings are physically made of, because this is where the city theory dies completely. The ridges that form the rings are made largely of different types of natural rock, and crucially, some of those rocks are sedimentary layers that formed underwater, at the bottom of an ancient sea, hundreds of millions of years ago. There are layers in the eye that contain the fossilized remains of marine life. Ancient sea creatures, locked in stone. These are rocks that were laid down grain by grain, over immense spans of time, on a long vanished ocean floor. Sit with that for a second, because it's the opposite of the Atlantis story in the most perfect way. The Atlantis legend says, a city sank into the sea. The geology of the eye says, a seabed rose up onto the land. The water didn't come and swallow a city. Instead, ancient seafloor, formed under deep water ages before any human existed, was lifted up and exposed. The sinking the myth demands is exactly backwards from what really happened to this rock. And we can date it. Not by guessing, but by the well-understood methods geologists use to read the age of stone. And the answer comes back not in thousands of years, the timescale of human civilization, but in hundreds of millions of years. The rocks at the eye of the Sahara are staggeringly ancient. We're talking about formations that date back hundreds of millions of years, to a time long before dinosaurs, let alone people. The very oldest rocks involved go back even further than that. This is not a structure that's 11,000 years old. It is, in its bones, 1,000 times older than that and more. To call it the ruins of a human city is like finding a mountain and insisting somebody stacked it last week. So if it wasn't built, and it didn't sink, then we are left with the real question, the good question, the one that's actually worth answering. How does nature carve a near-perfect set of giant concentric rings into the desert? Because that, after all, was the thing that started this whole mystery. The shape is real. The rings are real. Something made them. So what was it? And for a long time, even scientists got the first part of this wrong. When the eye was first studied seriously, the leading idea was that it must be an impact crater, that something from space, a massive meteorite, had slammed into the desert and blasted out these rings. It's a reasonable first guess. A lot of big circular features on Earth are impact craters. But when geologists looked closely, the impact theory fell apart too. Because an impact leaves very specific fingerprints. The violence of a meteorite strike melts and shocks the rock in ways that are unmistakable, and it tends to leave a deep bowl. At the eye, those telltale signs of a high-speed impact weren't there. And the structure isn't a bowl. It's essentially flat. The rings are at ground level, not sunk into a crater. So it wasn't aliens, it wasn't a meteorite, and it wasn't Atlantis. The real explanation is something slower, something quieter, and honestly something far more elegant. It's the story of how the planet itself, given enough time, can sculpt geometry more perfect than you'd ever believe possible. And once you understand the mechanism, you'll never look at this eye in the desert the same way again. Here is how the planet built the eye of the Sahara, and there are really just two ingredients. The first is uplift. The second is erosion. That's it. Two slow, patient forces working together over an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Let's start with the uplift. Long, long ago, deep beneath this part of what is now the Sahara, the rock was pushed upward from below. Imagine the layers of rock here, like a thick stack of paper lying flat, layer upon layer upon layer, each one a different type of stone laid down in a different era. Now imagine pushing up on the center of that stack from underneath. The flat layers bulge upward into a dome, a great rounded blister of rock, swelling up toward the surface. That's the first step. The land here was pushed up into an enormous dome, kilometers across. Now on top of that dome, you've got all these stacked layers of rock arranged in rings, because when you slice across a dome, the layers show up as circles, one inside the other, like the rings of an onion, or the contour lines on a map. So the concentric ring pattern was already there, hidden inside the dome, just waiting to be revealed. And here's the key thing you have to understand. Not all of those layers are equally tough. Some are made of hard, resistant rock that stands up to weathering. Others are made of soft, weak rock that crumbles and blows away easily. Hard layer, soft layer, hard layer, soft layer, stacked up through the dome. Now bring in the second force, erosion, time. Wind and the occasional ancient water, scouring across that dome for millions upon millions of years, wearing it down, grinding away at the surface. And erosion is not fair. It doesn't wear everything down at the same rate. It chews through the soft, weak rock quickly, carving it out into valleys and hollows. But when it hits the hard, resistant rock, it slows right down. And those tough layers are left standing, sticking up as ridges. The soft rings get scooped out low. The hard rings stand tall. And because those layers were arranged in circles to begin with, the ridges and valleys that erosion leaves behind are circles too. Concentric rings of high, tough rock, alternating with low, worn-away rock. The eye. That's it. That's the whole magic trick. Uplift creates the dome and arranges the layers in rings. Erosion eats away the soft rings and leaves the hard rings standing. Give it hundreds of millions of years, and you get a set of giant nested stone circles so regular that when humans finally saw them from space, our pattern-hungry brains screamed, "City." But no one designed it. No one built it. It is pure geology, the layered crust of the earth, lifted up and then unevenly worn down, exactly the way countless other dome structures around the world have been shaped. The eye of the Sahara is rare and spectacular because of its size and the flatness and clarity of those rings out in the bare desert, but the process that made it is something geologists understand well. And once you really grasp that, the original mystery just dissolves. The rings aren't perfect because a mind made them perfect. They're perfect because erosion is relentless and even-handed in how it treats the same rock layer all the way around a circle. The soft stuff goes everywhere it's soft. The hard stuff stays everywhere it's hard. Symmetry isn't proof of design. Sometimes it's just proof of time. So the eye of the Sahara is not Atlantis. It never was. It's the wrong age by a factor of thousands. It never sank, when sinking is the entire point of the legend. It was never an island. It contains no walls, no ruins, no trace of any human hand. And the rings that started the whole legend turn out to be the signature of uplift and erosion, not architecture. The case for Atlantis, the case that felt so strong an hour ago, has completely collapsed under the weight of the actual evidence. Which leaves one last question, and to me it's the most interesting one of all. If the truth is this clear, why do so many people so badly want it to be Atlantis? Why does this idea grip us so hard that millions of people choose a lost city over the real answer? And I think it tells us something about ourselves. The legend of the eye being Atlantis is actually a very modern myth. It couldn't have existed for most of history because nobody could even see the shape from the ground. It was born in the age of satellite imagery, when suddenly anyone with a computer could float above the planet and stare down at its surface. People started scanning the Earth from their screens, hunting for anomalies, for patterns, for secrets. And when they found this great staring eye in the desert, and someone connected it to Plato's rings, the story spread like wildfire, because it's a wonderful story. It's the dream that the world still has undiscovered secrets in it, that a lost golden civilization is out there, waiting, hidden in plain sight, and that we, from our screens, might be the ones to finally see it. And I understand that hunger completely. There is something in us that wants the world to be more mysterious, more magical, more full of lost wonders than the everyday version we're handed. We want there to be an Atlantis. We want to find the city under the sand. The idea that it's just geology can feel like a letdown, like the magician showing you the trick and ruining the show. But I'd ask you to look at it the other way around, because the real story is the more astonishing one. Think about what actually happened here. An ancient ocean floor, teeming with creatures that died and turned to stone hundreds of millions of years before the first human took a breath. The whole region pushed up from deep inside the planet into a vast dome. Then hundreds of millions of years of wind and weather, patiently carving that dome into a ring of stone nearly 50 kilometers wide, so precise and so huge that it can only be properly seen from orbit. No human hand needed, no lost city required, just the raw, slow, staggering power of the earth, writing its own history into the rock, in a shape so perfect it fooled all of us into seeing a civilization that was never there. That's not a disappointment. That is a far deeper kind of wonder than any myth. The planet didn't need Atlantis to be extraordinary. It just needed time. So the next time you see that eye in the desert, staring up out of the Sahara, I hope you don't see a drowned city anymore. I hope you see something better. A window, hundreds of millions of years deep, into the living history of the Earth itself. And if this changed the way you look at it, even a little, let me know in the comments which part surprised you the most, and consider subscribing, because the world is absolutely full of these. Places we've gotten completely wrong, and there's nothing I love more than going down to the rock and finding out what really happened.